Good day to you. So who has influence over the way that you behave today, and what has influence over the way that you behave today? Certainly the weather, right? The weather is going to make you walk faster. It's going to make you warm up your car. It's going to make you think twice about even going out at all. That's something that's influencing the way that you are today. Also, when you leave the house, if you've got money in your pocket, that's going to influence you. Are you close to payday and you still have some cash? That's going to influence something that you go out and buy today, food, clothing, etc. Or are you kind of in between paychecks, or you're kind of still trying to catch up for other debts, and that's going to affect what you're spending today, which is to say not much at all. Those are two influences on your life that impact the way that you are going to behave, whether you want to or not. And it's similar to media systems, because in media systems we have factors or influences that influence the way that media systems operate. And some of those influences can be internal. That means they can come from within, like your own money in your pocket. And some of those influences are from external areas, like the weather we talked about. So what this chapter is all about is regulation. That's what we're talking about. Regulation is what we mean when we're talking about where those influences come from. And regulation can come from several different sort of general categories that we'll be discussing today. One of those is government-related agencies, like the FCC is a government-related agency. That's a regulator. And then we've got the media organizations themselves, like they belong to associations, and they have certain codes of conduct. Like a lot of newspapers, for example, will not allow their employees to accept gifts of over $25 because they believe that there will then be sort of a tendency not to cover subjects, and organizations who gave those gifts cover them very critically because they've received a gift from them. So aside from government agencies and media organizations, we've also got citizen groups. Citizens get together and they try to influence the way that media operations go forward. A group like the Parents Television Council, if you don't know about that group, it's a parents group put together to try and get TV to be less sexual, less obscene, less superficial. One of the things that they've gone after in the past is portraying cosmetic surgery on children's related programs or young adults related programs, portraying cosmetic surgery as being positive. So we've got citizen groups. Then we've also got advertisers. Advertisers are big influencers. There's not a definite sort of direct, I'm on the phone with you as an advertiser telling this TV station, do not run this program criticizing soft drinks because I'm a soft drink manufacturer. It's not quite like that. It's more like the company NBC knows that if they run a sitcom or a drama and it's going to criticize the value of soft drinks, of sodas, that they may lose the Coke account. So advertisers are also regulators. And then finally, audiences, which is to say you. Audiences, people who watch, listen, and read and surf internet, TV, radio content. You decide. If you don't make something popular on TV by not watching it, it gets canceled. And so those are all the regulators that I address in this chapter. Keep in mind that we're kind of breaking through in this chapter. We're coming up above the ground. In the previous elements of media systems that we were taking a look at, we were looking down underneath the ground, digging around for philosophies, for cultural characteristics. Now we're coming full force out of the ground. We're looking at the trunk of the tree. This is what's holding up the tree in the media system. It's regulation. Now let's move on. Let's talk about an overall organization of countries that you may have heard of but may not have thought of in the capacity I'm about to describe, and that is the European Union, or the EU. If you don't live there, it's tough to know really what it's all about. It's not really a United States. It's not really a Pennsylvania and Washington being ruled by the same government, and yet there's a similarity to that. The European Union is an organization of European countries, but some of the differences are so wide. You've got many different languages, you've got many different currencies, although there is a euro currency. You've got different climates, you've got different people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Yet all of these people, if you join the EU, and there is a membership process, if you join the EU, you have some things in common, like no borders. You can go between your two countries with no borders. And you can spend the euro in almost all of the countries. England, or the UK, somehow got an exemption from that. But more to the point with this class, the EU has certain rules that if you're going to be a member, you have to abide by when it comes to airing media content. specifically with broadcasters. And one of those rules has to do with minutage. That's a word that you are probably getting to know for the first time in this chapter. Minutage looks like minutes, and that's where it comes from, because minutage speaks about a limit that you can have in your broadcast schedule, either radio or TV, a limit on how many minutes of advertising you have, because advertising is seen as harmful, or advertising is seen as breaking up the aesthetics of the program, or advertising is seen as inappropriate. There are other reasons as well, but this is part of the European Union's way of operating the countries that subscribe to it, that are members to it, with minutage. And then there's one more term. It's not an EU term, but I just want to introduce it because the EU also has it inside of it, and so does the United States, and so does another country as well. It's the term called watershed. That's a term that here in the United States we refer to as safe harbor. They are the same idea. Safe harbor, watershed. What that is a time period at night for TV and radio broadcasters, at night and in the morning, I should say, where the programmers can be a little bit looser with the language. The language can be racier, it can be more sexual, it can have more drug references, it can be slightly more violent. It's called safe harbor because that's the harbor where you sail into and you know you're not going to get followed by the FCC and fined. At least that's what it's referred to in our country as. Watershed has a similar idea. It's that's when you finally get to the point where the water's going to overflow when you get out of that watershed, and then you've got problems. So this is all about making content influenced in a way that loosens it up, assuming that it's already kind of tightly regulated. Now let's go to the individual countries and see what's happening with regulation in those countries. I just find it fascinating how different the regulation is depending on what country you go to. And we'll start with France. No regulation of the newspapers in France, and that's true for most of the countries in this book. No regulation of the internet, but when it comes to broadcast media, yeah, you've got a big regulator like the FCC. It's called the CSA, Council of Audiovisual is basically what it translates. It cannot roll out its own regulations like the FCC can, but it can apply regulations that are developed by the state. So a lot of the regulations are coming out of the state, and then they are being rolled out by the CSA. That means defined and applied and published. That's what the CSA is doing. And the four main areas that the CSA takes a look at is one is called political pluralism. Now, we don't have anything like that in this country that's a regulation, but political pluralism says that if you're going to be a new radio station in France, you've got to add to the mix that's already there. And so to hear the CSA representative who I interviewed on the banks of the Paris up in her high-rise, on the banks of the Seine, I should say, that's the river in Paris, up in her high-rise office, she was saying we have atheist radio, we have Muslim radio, we have Jewish radio, we have punk rock radio, we have anarchist radio. She's going through all the different kinds of radio that I have never even envisioned as genres. And that's because France wants political pluralism, in part because they experienced World War II, where they felt that one political philosophy in particular, fascism, ended up causing an entire world war and taking over their culture by surprise. So they don't want that again. They want safeguards in the media and the people accessing various opinions. It's interesting to see now, how well this is holding up with the bombings of Charlie Hebdo that we referred to a little while ago, where I heard yesterday on the news that some young people are having their passports rescinded. Invalidated was the term used, because they're planning to travel to an Islamic nation, and there's evidence that the French people think they're going to be radicalized there, whatever that means. But political pluralism is one of the four areas of regulation. The second one is protection of minors. You will find this to be the case in Britain and also in Sweden, and it's no erotic content before 8 p.m. It's earlier than our watershed, which starts at 10 p.m., and no erotic content, no gratuitous violence, no violence with no purpose, no punching, no showing blood, without a deep and meaningful purpose behind that violence. And then thirdly, as an area of regulation, you've got protection of the French language. We spoke about how proud the French are of their language. Well, this is to protect it. And so it's to make sure that you don't have words like hamburger coming into the country and becoming a very common way of talking about this thing that you hold in your hands and you eat. No, the French went their own words. Same with computer. Ordinateur is a French word for computer. It's nothing like our word of computer. In music, a certain percentage of songs have to be in the French language, especially because they don't want their young people growing up only singing English songs and losing the ability to express themselves in this beautiful French language. And then the last area of France that is regulated when it comes to media is advertising, minutage. And on public television channels, you'll find this not to be the case for any other country in the book, but public television channels like PBS and NPR, those channels, on their public TV channels, those channels can air no more than 8 minutes of advertising per hour. Now, the fact that they can even air advertising is very strange, and it's a very unique French thing because they're a public TV station. We wouldn't see NPR airing advertisements. We wouldn't see PBS airing an advertisement in the middle of Sesame Street. It doesn't happen. But in France, it's there, but it's limited to 8 minutes per hour. Commercial TV can air no more than 12 minutes per hour. There are no restrictions on radio. Moving to Sweden now, Sweden has a lot of regulation that comes directly from the central government, kind of like France, except the government agencies are not so much the regulators as are the legislators, the people who write the laws. That's where the legislation is coming from. And newspapers actually have a very strong guarantee of freedom of the press. In fact, the Swedish Constitution in all effects in the 1700s became the basis for our freedom of the press. We kind of borrowed that idea, freedom of the press, and Sweden is very, very, very hard on that and making sure that all press have as much freedom as possible, but at the same time, they have to have a chain of responsibility. If there's going to be a complaint, we have to be able to find out who exactly wrote the story and who investigated the research that led to that story if there's a complaint. That's very important in Swedish regulation. And then Sweden also has a tradition of a press ombudsman. We don't have that too much in the newspaper world here. We can see it in some big companies in the United States, but an ombudsman is somebody who settles the peace between disputing parties. So if you've got a reader or a person who's been covered by a newspaper who feels that the newspaper covered them illegally or wrongly or got the facts wrong, the newspaper may not have to publish anything if they don't want to change the story, but the ombudsman is going to come in and is going to make a ruling on whether the newspaper needs to print a retraction or clarify something or whether the story was correct to begin with. When it comes to broadcasters, they are very strongly regulated in Sweden. In fact, there are 2 public broadcasters and only one commercial broadcaster. I'm talking about terrestrial, I'm talking about broadcasters, I'm not talking about cable, I'm not talking about satellite, I'm talking about broadcasters. And the private broadcaster didn't come along until 1992. And a lot of the reason for that is because that Sweden believes that the commercial world is something that should be kept in a containment. It should be kept so that it doesn't take over your life, commercialism. So it's a small piece of it. And so they actually have 2 to 1, 2 public broadcasters to 1. Now, there are 2 government agencies that regulate in Sweden. One's called the Radio and TV Authority. The other's called the Broadcast Commission. You can read in more detail about that. But here are the areas that are regulated in Sweden. We've got advertising minutage there, even less minutes than you will see in France. So advertising minutage when it comes to TV and radio, by the way, has advertising minutage. But a second area that's different is what they call social responsibility. And that has to do with how alcohol is portrayed. It has to do, and in fact, no alcohol can be advertised for if it has more than 15% alcohol in it. So that rules out a lot of hard alcohol. Sexual content is also regulated, but it's kind of strange. It's not what you would think. I've seen a lot of really, extremely vivid sexual content on Swedish television. It's just it happens to be regulated in such a way that it has to be presented as natural. They even have radio call-in shows, for example, where a girl can call up and say, my boyfriend's pressuring me into having sex, and I've only ever masturbated, and I'm not sure if I want to do. These are how direct the phone calls are in Sweden. These are how sexual they are, but think about it. It's purely educational in a way, as hard as it is to hear. Lastly, Sweden is very strongly regulating in the area of violence, especially gratuitous violence. Certain films like Casino, if you know that film, gangster film, a mob gangster film from the U.S., are banned because of the violence. So they're very, very strong. Sweden sees itself as a peaceful country. It's one of the two countries that remain neutral even in World War II, and they want to preserve that tradition of peace and nature. Moving on to the UK now. The UK has the most comprehensive and powerful media regulator. It's called Ofcom, or the Office of Communication. And the Ofcom office does not regulate newspapers. In fact, newspapers are very, very free in Britain, even more so, I think, than Sweden in terms of what the actual content is. Although there is a press complaints commission, which will try to impact newspapers and get them to show some exercise if they keep going after a particular person. But broadcasting is what is regulated very, very strongly. And in fact, Britain treats all broadcasters as public service broadcasters. Even commercial ones, they have to have public service standards. And on page 98, there's a mission that's described all about that. Commercial stations, TV stations, they're all regulated. Here are the areas. Number one is advertising. Again, we've got minutage there. It's a little bit more liberal in Britain. You can have some more ads. However, certain ads cannot be inserted into certain genres of programming. Here's a different area for us in Britain. For example, no ads in documentaries. Documentaries have to run complete. No ads in royal ceremonies covering the royal families. No ads in religious services, children's programming. And ads must be 20 minutes apart. You can't have an ad break 5 minutes and then 5 minutes later another one because you go to a timeout in a football game. That's how advertising is regulated in England. Also, protection of children. Protection of children. No ads for merchandise based on children's programs. You can't sell Barney. You can't sell anything that children are watching on a TV ad. And no ads with alcohol next to children's programming as well. Another area of regulation for Britain is taste and decency. Programs that encourage crime or social disorder are just not permitted. They're not allowed to go forward. Nudity and sexual activity are allowed if they are justified within the plot. And having watched a lot of TV in Britain, I can say every single night you're going to see a topless woman in British TV. It's just part and parcel of TV because it's part and parcel of life. And so if you have, and it favors the woman, I have to say, you don't see as many naked men, although you can see them from behind, not from the front, from behind. So if you have a couple and they go up to bed and they're married and they're getting ready to hit the sack and they take their clothes off, that's part of the plot. You show them naked in Britain. Seems to be an important part of the plot, so that's allowed. And also, finally, an area of regulation is production quotas. Production quotas is all about making sure that the small companies still have a chance to produce content for the big companies, because you don't want corporations only coming up with the ideas that invent, The Voice and American Idol and all these other reality television programs, and the Shark Tank and, Mark Burnett, for example, his name is all over productions on MTV. And nothing wrong with Mark Burnett or what he produces, but Britain wants to make sure that the little production company has a chance to enter into the game. Okay, we're going to move on now. We're going to come to the United States. Sorry, we're going to Mexico next. Mexico is kind of in a state of flux. I've done a lot of consulting a little bit of consulting down there to help them with the regulation. Most of the regulation still comes out of their government, and there's still some allegations of unfairness and shall we say, money changing hands to keep certain favors for certain TV and radio content providers, broadcasters, that is to say. But essentially, you do have a government agency called the Secretary of the Government, and also another one called the Ministry of Transportation. And today, those two are the ones that are trying to regulate Mexican media. Part of what we find different about Mexico when it comes to regulation is that there is a regulation that says that radio and TV stations have to provide time to the government for the government to make its own announcements. Now imagine if President Obama, and it wouldn't be him personally, but imagine if the White House had it written into media law here that every Sunday at 1 o'clock they got to make an announcement about progress that the United States is making in the war against terror, in the economy improving, or in gas prices going down. And just imagine that we don't have that. What we do have is the presidency will call a press conference, and then some media, not all, maybe not even most, will choose to cover it. In Mexico, that's a guaranteed right as part of regulation. Now, when it comes to specific content regulation of what the TV station and radio station is providing, you have minutage. You have minutage, and it's 6 hours on cable and satellite, and then it's very strange over on regular broadcasters. It's 18% of total transmission time. So up to 20% of broadcaster, almost, can be ads if they want it to be. So it doesn't really sound like much of a regulation at all. Also, they have questionable programming on TV is another area of regulation. Questionable programming of TV is where alcohol and prescription ads must first be approved by the Ministry of Health to make sure that there's nothing misleading going on out there, no fine print, no real quick speak at the end of the commercial saying if you have this affliction, if you have this affliction, if your blood pressure goes up, do not take it. None of that. And then lastly, an area of regulation, kind of a holdover for the past, but really trying to protect current strides, is criticism of the government. Now, you can criticize the government, and most do sensationally, but you cannot, according to Mexican regulations, insult officials. You cannot call the president of Mexico an idiot or a moron or a wife cheater. You can't do that. You can criticize him, President Nieto, for his policies, but you can't do those things. All right, now we're going to go on to China. China regulation is the strongest out of all the countries because it's a communist state, and the media are an extension of that communist philosophy and making sure that it espouses the communist ideals. And so all media, even including the internet and newspapers as well, are regulated by the government. Now, generally speaking, media have freedoms in the area of entertainment. Pop songs, for example, they're not regulated. And comedy shows, they're not regulated. And fun adventures, they're not regulated. But media that has anything political in it, anything that talks about China as a culture, those media are regulated. And private media, by the way, are just not allowed in China. They're not permitted. All media is owned by the people, ostensibly, but really the Chinese government. Each newspaper has to be registered with the government. Each article has to be approved before it can be published. They have big government bodies to do this. They have the State Council. They have the Propaganda Department. But now in specific areas of regulation that China is known for, one is criticism of the government, and it's just not allowed. You can't criticize, for example, the one-child policy, trying to slow China's population growth by allowing children only to parents only to have one child. Can't criticize that. Can't debate it. You have to get behind it. Advertising is another area. Unappetizing is not allowed. So sanitary napkins can't advertise in China. Hemorrhoid treatments? No. Athlete's foot cream? No, not in China. It's unappetizing. Maybe appetizing is not the best word, but it's unseemly. Let's put it that way in the Chinese view. Also, advertising has minutage limits too, no more than 12 minutes per hour. Yes, advertising is on Chinese media. And then finally, culturally appropriate content is an area that's regulated. Culturally appropriate content. And that means in China, your programming cannot contain sex, cannot contain foreign content that's more than 20% of the overall content. It can't contain violence. It can't contain explicit drug use. These are areas that the Chinese people don't feel that the Chinese government feel that Chinese people should be exposed to. Let's go on now to Ghana. Ghana, it's a weak government, kind of. It's still a little bit gun-shy about regulation because the Chinese government went through so much dictatorship, so much dictatorial powers that they are very reluctant to hand over any powers to the government. So there is a media commission. It's appointed by the government, but it's very, very weak. It can only suggest things that media should do and provide arbitration. That means a way of solving problems if two sides disagree. One of the main roles, kind of in keeping with developmental philosophy, is they train journalists there in Ghana. They train journalists. Now, the areas of guidelines that are suggested by the regulation, even though it's a very weak regulation, is political reporting, and that has to do with ensuring free and fair campaigns, making sure that the newspapers don't take up trashing one particular campaign and favoring another one. Remaining impartial, in other words, and avoiding the promotion of violent conflict. That's all part of political reporting. A second area is rejoinders. Rejoinders is to allow an offended party, a person who has been offended by some newspaper coverage, to have a response, to be able to defend themselves, to defend their name, to defend their position. And then lastly is broadcasting standards as an area of guidelines for Ghana. And in this area, it's about not promoting drunkenness. Do not promote drunkenness as a way to go. The Jersey Shore would never be programmable in Ghana on that basis. And not promoting public behavior that is embarrassing or destructive. Now that takes us to our last country. We're not going to discuss the U.S. today. We're going to let you read that one on your own. The last country we're talking about is Lebanon today. Most regulation comes out of Parliament. It is the weakest country where regulation is. You have regulations on the books, but a lot of them are just ignored because the ownership groups of the media are also the same relatives and the people as the people who are in government. So you have a conflict of interest there. Now, newspapers, oddly enough, are licensed as to two different types. This is different from any other country. In Lebanon, newspapers are licensed either as political newspapers or non-political. And if you're licensed as a non-political newspaper, you can't do politics. And vice versa, if you're licensed as a political newspaper, you have to stick with politics. And that's so that people know exactly what they're getting into when they're reading a newspaper. This is what the focus is what's supposed to be. This is what the expertise is. Now, there was something called a publications law of 1962, which served as a method of regulation, too. And what it does is it encourages self-censorship during times of crisis, wars, for example, or invasions. And a lot of times you have Lebanon becomes a place where other groups camp out, and the Lebanese government can't even control them. And the other groups are bombed by Israel, like Hezbollah, bombed because they're camping out in Lebanon. It has nothing to, well, I won't say it has nothing to do with Lebanon, but Lebanon doesn't have the power to say you leave. And so you have a foreign group coming in, and they're at conflict with another nation. And now you've got a big problem as a Lebanese regulator and media. So they ask newspapers not to take sides in these situations, not to start to promote the Hezbollah, not to criticize Israel, or vice versa, promote Israel, criticize Hezbollah. That's what they don't want, because it went through Lebanon so many years of civil war, and if you drive around, you still find a lot of bombed out buildings and a lot of destruction that's still there, even though it's a beautiful country with mountains and beautiful beaches. You would never know that, but Lebanon has those things. So specifically, here are the areas that media broadcasters are looked at. One of them is domestic programs, and that's to say that Lebanese programs must comprise 16.6% of all the programs available. And that's a way of making sure that all of the television doesn't become U.S. imports or British imports or French imports, making sure that Lebanese imports still, Lebanese productions still are being made, and giving local businesses a chance to do that, even though 16.6% isn't much. And then the second area is political opinion. It's illegal in Lebanese media to criticize heads of state. I mean, Lebanon's a tiny country, and if you go criticizing the president of Iran or a king of Saudi Arabia, then you may find yourself invaded. You may find yourself the target of violence and money operations, funding groups that are against you. And then this specifically is part of the political union. You're not allowed to promote relations with Israel. Lebanon is at war with Israel, has been at war since 1948. It's an enemy. Israel probably, I don't know for a fact, has the same view towards Lebanon, and so you're not allowed to promote relations, try and better things there. And the last area is advertising. Advertising should be presented clearly and differently from regular programming. You can't have a program that ends like a children's cartoon and then goes right into an ad that sounds like it, looks like it, has the same characters, because the child doesn't know the difference. The child doesn't follow that one is a regular program and the other is trying to sell that child money. Okay, and speaking of that, I just want to pop back to Sweden. I shouldn't do this, but I want to make sure you know about it. It's very important. And that is, in Sweden, no ads geared towards children, period. Children are seen as young and inexperienced, and so you cannot go after them with cereals that are full of sugar. You cannot go after them with plastic toys that will break after the third time they use them. You cannot go after them with video games that will suck in their minds and have them playing for an hour. I'm describing things from a Swedish vantage point. Children need to make it to the age of 16 before they can start deciding for themselves about products that they see on TV. In the meantime, they are protected. All right, well, that will wrap up what turned out to be kind of a long video lecture for today, but I believe a necessary one. I hope you do too. We've just finished media regulation. Have a great day.